if you look around when you're 1-0 down and you look at your bench and you have those 6 words behind you, there's no way that you're going to trust that bench to go and change the game for you. They're people before players. You can have all the data in the world, but if that player doesn't feel empowered and confident, they're going to fall at the first hurdle. The gaffer's turned to me and gone, "Are you ready to come on? Like, you're going to have to come on here." And I just thought, I felt panicky is what I felt. I was like, Christ, I'm nowhere near ready. I think they changed their left back and their left winger every single time for the last 6 games running. So their left channel was always going to have fresh legs or fresh ideas. He said you have to be rejected 1,000 times in order to be successful.
Hello and welcome back to my channel, and as you can tell, it's time for another industry chat video, and today's guest is Sammy Lander. So Sammy is actually a substitution coach within football. So Sammy is a great example of how networking, hard work and pure determination basically can create a role that you want. So it's a really interesting conversation actually. We speak about the kind of psychological impacts of being a substitute, and also how, how important substitutes can actually be in the role of the modern day game. So, there's lots of things that we do kind of mention which kind of provoke more thoughts actually. So it's a really, I found this conversation really, really interesting. So I hope you do too. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Sammy Lander. Sammy Lander, welcome to the channel. How are you doing today, mate?
I'm very well, thank you, Chris. How are you?
I'm very well as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. So before we kind of get started, I just want to kind of caveat. So on this channel, we have had mainly analysts, because I come from an analyst background, but analysts, we've had scouts, recruitment, fitness guys, and, a bit of a random mixture of people, but I've never ever spoke to a substitution coach. So when I kind of stumbled across you, I wanted to reach out and make sure I got you on. So thanks very much for being open to doing it. So we're going to kind of speak about obviously what you do and what a substitution coach is. As I say, I've given you a slight brief introduction, but for those who don't know who you are, Sammy, if you just want to kind of give a bit of an overview and what you're currently doing, basically.
Yeah, so I'm a coach at heart, but I want to work at the top level, and to do that without having a big playing background, you've got to try and put yourself on the map. So the way that I've done that is by sort of specialising in a certain aspect of football, and I chose substitution. So I was appointed the first substitutions coach sort of last 18 months ago, last summerish. And now I work as a substitute consultant for teams all over the world. So yeah, it's a nice, rather niche role.
Amazing. No, really good. So you just mentioned there, so you didn't really come from a playing background. So what is your background, Sammy? How did you, has football always been your passion? Like, how did you kind of get in? Looking at your profile, you've got a bit of an analysis and scouting background in there as well. So how did you kind of stumble into that first? And obviously then we'll see how that led on to where you are now.
Yeah, so it was, unfortunately, I had sort of like a car crash when I was younger, and I lost the sight of my right eye. So that like really set my back sort of like physically. And that sort of meant that I was never really going to make it as a footballer. And that's what I tell myself, if it wasn't for the car crash, I'd have been 2 Ballon d'Ors in now, I think. But yeah, so after that, I was like, well, everyone says you've got to work in your passion. And I was like, what am I passionate about? And football was always the one for me. It's something that I just never get bored of. So I was like, okay, well, I've got to work in football then. So I started at Brentford in the academy, then went to Bournemouth Academy. Worked a little bit at Weymouth and done a bit for the sort of numerous sort of one-off scouting teams, and it's led to me being where I am today, really. But I've always said that I want to be a gaffer. I want to be a first team manager or a coach. Yeah. And I think, again, I've mentioned it because I haven't had this huge playing background. I'm probably going to have to start a little bit lower down. I'm not going to walk into a championship job or anything. So the lower down you go in football, you have to have the ability to do everything, because, the budgets are so small that you can't have an analysis department, a physiotherapy department, a sports science department. So you as a manager have to have a good understanding of the fundamentals of each. So throughout my career, I've almost just tried to expose myself to as much analysis, recruitment, physical side of things, sports science, as much as possible, so that when my time comes, I feel comfortable handling sort of all the departments.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because how old are you, Sammy? You're still
26. Yeah, recently 26.
So, yeah. So still, obviously, like you say, learning and obviously trying to make your way in the game. So that's really, really interesting. So, okay, so for those then, kind of, Sammy, give us an overview. What the hell does a substitution coach do? What are you doing? And what's the role? What's the purpose of the job, basically?
Yeah, so the purpose of the job is to make sure that the substitutes are performing to the best of their abilities, and that their productivity and effectiveness are the 2 words that I sort of refer to as high as possible. That can look like a number of different ways, though, because it's quite a holistic approach. So each club I go to sort of favour a different part of this sort of concept that I've designed. So Some people love the psychological side, you know, in which case my skills in man managing and trying to work out personalities and empowering players really comes sort of the forefront of it. I've been to other clubs who love the data side of things, where that's where you've got to be a little bit more comfortable with the metrics behind it all and the way that we analyze these substitutes. So it's my job to have that holistic approach and make sure that they're feeling sort of effective and productive in all of it.
Yeah. So then in terms of the motivation and the psychological side of things, then I'm presuming that is kind of quite hands-on with the players, with the, you know, the guys that aren't starting, then that's where you kind of come to the forefront then. So are you spending time with the players and kind of doing your thing with, you know, kind of close-knit with them?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'd like to think that actually some of the players I've worked with will probably be friends for life now, because you sort of form a little bond with them, that you understand the process that they're going through, or the journey that they're going through. And it allows you to really develop friendships that have lasted till now anyways. But yeah, you have to be on hand, because they're people before players. So just as anyone, if someone's a little bit upset or discouraged or you know, down about being a substitute, which is completely natural, you have to be there, and you can have all the data in the world, but if that player doesn't feel empowered and confident, then you know, they're going to fall at the first hurdle.
Yeah, definitely. Because we will touch a bit on the data, you know, later on, because obviously that's kind of when I first thought of the role. Obviously, the psychological thing is one aspect, but as you said, in terms of, you know, you can really kind of when a substitution is made, when can players make the best impact? Different players are obviously going to make different impacts as well. So, you know, there's lots of different ways you can kind of do it. Almost, it is a full-on, you know, psychological coaching and analyst position, really. So there's all different aspects to it. So that's really interesting. So, you know, I've heard in other kind of interviews you've done, Sammy, in terms of how it came about. So I know you may have said this before, but in terms of, you know, your time at, you know, Weymouth, I think it was, where you were a coach at the time. So can you just kind of run over that? And was that kind of almost a spark to kind of lead you into the basically coming up with the position of a substitution coach?
Yeah, so I was about 20, 21, 22, 23. It was across the 3 years I was there, and my role sort of got bigger every year. As we went up the leagues, we done quite well, and I got to a stage where I was first team coach at sort of 23 and around National League, and we were a part-time team in a full-time league. You know, we were Weymouth. We didn't really have a budget. We didn't have a kit man for half the season, so you know, we were all having to muck in and do the kit, and we were going to these teams like Notts County, who had 18,000 seater stadiums and 4 kit men that were all in full-time. You know, so we all had to really muck in, and through COVID, you know, that financial restraint probably felt more than ever because of the whole sort of aftermath that COVID brought. So we had to be a little bit more careful with how we spent our money, and that resulted in you know, players not sometimes being able to be selected through not being able to be paid and furloughing and all these different types of things. So when that started happening, I started getting named on the bench as a substitute, and I was buzzing. You know, you can see there, so that's the shirt that I actually got made up. I walked in, we was playing Maidenhead in the FA Trophy, and I walk in, and I knew that we had a few sort of problems with filling the squad, but you know, when I was walking in with my boots, I didn't think that I was about to be named on the bench. Yeah, and they just sort of said, "Chairman's got a shirt made up for you. You're going to be on the bench today." And I thought, this is it. Then this is the start of a career for me.
Yeah.
But it was that in 89th minute or late on in the game, striker's gone down, and the gaffer's turned to me and gone, "Are you ready to come on? Like, you're gonna have to come on here." And I just thought, I felt panicky, is what I felt. You know, I was like, Christ, I'm nowhere near ready. You know, I haven't opened my legs. I've been eating jelly babies. I'm sat in my bench coat. I'm tuned into the game tactically, because that's what you have to do as a coach. But in terms of touching the ball and all these things, I was like, nowhere near ready. And that was like that light bulb moment for me, where I was like, wow, like, this is obviously that feeling that other players are going to have when they're substitutes. Is that empathy of going through the experience and then relating it to them. And that's when it sort of started, and then I snowballed into this big thing, and it's managed to really become a concept now, which is cool.
Perfect. So did you actually get on that game? Did you get on the pitch?
No, it's a striker jumped back up, and I was absolutely fuming. I know. It was so close. You know, physio's gone on and physio's shaking his head, but he's jumped up and he's finished the game. So I was devastated.
Very good. So in terms of then, obviously your big kind of after that one was Wimbledon, wasn't it? In terms of where you were kind of known to be the first substitution coach. So how did that come about then, Sammy? Did you just totally just reach out to them? Did you have contacts already at the club? And you're just curious to know how you kind of fell into that?
Yeah, so a real big thing for me is having like mentors, and people I aspire to be in the game. And so throughout lockdown, I reached out to loads of people on LinkedIn and just said, "Can I have 20 minutes of your time? Steal some ideas, run some ideas past you, get some advice." And I did that with 9 or 10 coaches who I sort of aspire to, have the career that they've had.
Yeah.
And one of those was Andy Parslow at Wimbledon. So he was the restarts coach there. And we'd spoken a little bit, and he sort of said how great Mark Robinson was, the Wimbledon manager, and how it's really open and receptive environment. And so I sort of thought, okay, like maybe I'll reach out to him and run the idea past him, and maybe football's not ready for it, or maybe they'll love it, or
Yeah.
and yeah, they invited me into the training ground. I went and watched training, presented the concepts to them and some of the data that I had collected from their previous season. And and that's where it was, and they offered me the position there, so that was cool.
Perfect. Yeah. So I mean, I know Andy because Andy's been on this channel as
Oh,
well.
okay, yeah.
Yeah, it was
Andy's
really
cool, yeah.
interesting. He knows his stuff, and he's similar to, I get the same kind of vibe. Obviously, he's always kind of looking to learn and kind of improve on what he can offer clubs. So yeah, that was interesting. You mentioned Andy. So, and again, like it was, I think just last week, or whenever this video goes out, did a video recently on networking and kind of how useful that can be. And you've just kind of the fact there, just have the balls to reach out to people and share ideas, and you just don't know what's going to come of it. And obviously, if you wouldn't have done that, you wouldn't have got the role at Wimbledon, and you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. So it's amazing what can come of just sending a message. So
100%.
It obviously went kind of well there in terms of they liked the idea, and they were open for you to come in. So, were there any kind of, because obviously there's not just Andy and the manager, were there any sort of doubts in terms of substitution coach? Like, what's this guy doing? Like, do we need this guy? What was there any kickback that you kind of seen? Or, I mean, I get the impression that they're quite a progressive club in terms of they're open to ideas. So maybe that's the case.
Yeah, no. So I did face a little bit of kickback when I was sort of calling around a few clubs that might have been interested in this concept, because obviously I reached out to Wimbledon, and I had a few. That was the first club that I approached with the idea, formally. I'd had a few phone calls with a few managers at other clubs, like I say, that were role models, and that didn't always go the best. I remember one phone call in particular who just told me to give up, said it wouldn't be a thing, said you're in a great position now as first team coach at 23 at Weymouth. Stay with that, because if that's the career path you're on, then that will get you to where you want to be. And I thought, okay, that's something to consider. But he said to give up on the subs idea, I didn't think it would be a thing. So you face a little bit of resilience. But at Wimbledon, like, I can't fault a player, a coach, a staff member, a fan, even really. Like, everyone was completely on board with it, because it was such an open and receptive environment that people recognised that this did have value, and particularly the players. Like, when I left Wimbledon, I was actually quite moved by the reaction that I got from these guys, because sometimes you think maybe you're not having the relationship that you have had with players. Maybe it's a little bit surface level.
Yeah.
But then when I left, all these brilliant messages from, I think, pretty much the whole squad. I think there was only a couple when they were January signings, messaged me to say thanks for my input and my contributions, and that they'd love to stay in touch. And even to this day, there's still 7 or 8 of them that I text and call a little bit. So yeah, it was really nice, really well received, and it's a testament to the people that are in the club.
Yeah, definitely. Because again, before you jumped on, Sammy, I was kind of doing a bit of last minute prepping and research, and that I did stumble across on the website Wimbledon, there was some quotes from players that said, Sammy made a great impact for me in terms of the psychological aspect, coming off the bench and being benched as well, because that can be an issue, as you mentioned. So that's really interesting. So yeah, it is a niche role, but I'm sure you're obviously, I think it's so interesting to me in terms of the data side as well, which, like I said, we will touch on. But in terms of the psychological impact, then Sammy, so there are certain players that kind of expect to be on the bench. That maybe that's their role more so, or they're more of an impact player. But on the flip side, if someone is to get dropped or just rested or whatever, then that can play a part on their mentality and how they kind of approach the game. So what kind of, if we just kind of speak about that psychological impact then, in terms of how players may feel if they are benched, and how role like your role can help to alleviate that.
Yeah, so when I first started designing the concept and thinking about what I want to do to try and address all the different parts of this concept, I went into a Premier League club and a League One club, um, and just had free reign to ask the players how did they feel rather about being a substitute. What were the emotions they experienced, what was the stigma that they had with it, what were the association of words that they had with being a substitute. And it was horrible, the words that were coming back, like disheartened, negative, defeated, not wanted, unconfident, all of these words. You just think, if you look around when you're 1-0 down and you look at your bench and you have those 6 words behind you, there's no way that you're going to trust that bench to go and change the game for you. So that was it for me. It was, again, a light bulb. I think we've got to do something about this, because you can't have players feeling like that. So we started almost finding ways, and the best way that you could find really is just being a person and treating these guys as people, because I said it in a previous podcast that very rarely are you taught how to be a substitute. And I'm not saying for one second that you should be, because when you're young, it's all about playing and enjoyment, and I'm very much for that. But up until under 18s, where you have to play 50% of minutes or whatever it is, and then you get called up to the first team and you're on the bench for 10 games in a row, that transition is a real big transition. And I think if you can start educating players on how to manage those emotions and roles and little things like that, then that transition could become so much easier and people can understand the role of a substitute, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what you've said there in terms of, I mean, the dynamic nature of the game now is it's not just about the starting 11, and obviously you can make more subs now, because when I kind of speak to when I speak to my dad and stuff, they used to only name one guy on the bench, so it's totally changed, and it's important for the people that I say on the bench. They are just as important as the 11 to come on and make an impact. So just on that, actually, you kind of. I don't know if it was you that coined the phrase, but rather than calling them substitutions, they are, you know them as finishers, in terms of the guys that finish the game. What was the thought process about that?
Yeah, so it was Eddie Jones, and he'd actually been in at Wimbledon before, so that phrase was actually already there when I went in, was finishers. What we did as part of my concept was try and develop that further, and we started introducing energizers, closers, match winners, match impactors, drivers, momentum givers. We had all these names, and what we found is that those names started giving players an idea of what they needed to do in a game. So, for example, if someone was an energizer, our starting 11 had gone a little bit flat. We needed you to come on and bring some fresh legs and some fresh energy and some fresh personality into the game. A closer would be someone who's, when we're 2-0 up, the closer would come on and see the game out. And those words not only empowered players, but it also gave them an idea of what we want from them. And again, I think as a substitute, that Steve Salis, who's the mindset coach at Wimbledon, always said that misalignment is chaos. So that alignment between calling them an energizer means that they knew what they had to go and do in a football game to impact it in a positive way. So we found a great deal of success with that.
Yeah, perfect. So, and this question isn't just aimed at your time at Wimbledon, Sammy, just in general. I mean, if you were to work at a club, what kind of impacts would you say that you would be able to bring to a club? I know not just kind of numbers and goals scored off the bench, etc. But what kind of benefits would a person like you bring to a club, would you say?
Yeah, so the thing that I pride myself on in this concept is that I found a way to be more deliberate with our substitutions. And I believe that when you're more deliberate with something, you're more consistent and you're more effective. Like, how often do you see a substitute come off the bench, do really well one week, and then have 3 bad weeks? Yeah. And it's because there's no consistency with being a substitute. And I think I found a way with all these sort of deliberate sort of things we implemented at Wimbledon and other clubs I've worked with, that allows us to be consistent and effective. And ultimately, it helps the team achieve more successful results across the season using substitutes.
Yeah, definitely. So, because obviously everyone knows, if you've been to a game, like the warm-up of the starting 11 is quite rigorous. They do a lot, but then you'll see players come on at half time, and sometimes you see them, they just walk out the tunnel and they've not even been on the pitch or anything. So they come off and then they're expected to then be at the level of everyone else on that pitch, having not even done a proper warm-up. So one thing I did see in another, I don't know if it was a written interview that you did, in terms of just using that half time, obviously there's 15 minutes of time there where if the manager is looking to make a change for the second half, then it's about making the most of that time and obviously getting the player up to speed, ready to come on. So that was really interesting. And I mean, is that something that you would do, Sammy, in terms of if they are looking to make an early change in the second half, to get on the pitch at that time?
Yeah, I just think it's an important part of the game to utilise as being a substitute, because let's say that the last time you touch a ball as a substitute is before the game, and it's in a rondo capacity, or you have a bit of free time, you do some diags. Let's say the average substitute's at 72 minutes, plus 15 minutes half time. You're now talking it's an hour and a half later since they last touched the football, and they're expected to come on, make their first 5 passes, and potentially send a cross in that's going to be a game-changing assist. Yeah. And you're going, well, that's unfair. You know what I mean? I go to the park all the time, and my first 10 are horrific. You know what I mean? There's only the 11th where I start turning into Trent. So, naturally, you're gonna have to train those habits, and I believe that technique is very maintenance and habits and that sort of thing. And yeah, that 15 minutes really allows you to put that into place for any potential second half substitutions.
Yeah, sure. So then recently we've kind of seen a couple of, and I know every league and organisation might be a little bit different, but in terms of now allowing more substitutions, in terms of, I think, is it 5 now? Is that?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. So it's kind of over. You can't just bring 5 individual subs on. You have to kind of do it in
like a 3 period. Yeah. Certain times. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously that forces them to either make a double or a triple at some point if they want to use all of them. So I seen did you put something out on LinkedIn? I've been stalking you a little bit here.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So in terms of what kind of impact that will have, because I think it did it come about in terms of the coaches were saying obviously a lot of games and the strain on players, so we want to be able to make more subs. But then I think the question that you were kind of looking at was, would them subs then make the team better or worse having access to more? And if you just want to kind of explain a little bit in terms of
of course. Yeah. So my theory on this particular aspect was, I think that substitutes often come on unprepared. And I think when you really break down what a substitute's contribution to a game is, and you look at it on a piece of paper, it tends to be not great reading. And last season, you still have 8 outfielders sort of carrying the 3 substitutes in a way. And obviously that's not the rule for every substitute. There are some substitutes that do fantastic, but not consistently. So those 3 substitutes that you bring on can sometimes just go under the radar a little bit, because the 8 existing players that are already in the flow and the rhythm of the game tend to just keep going, and the 3 substitutes can now sort of work their way in. But now I think we've gone to 5. Let's say we're playing 4-3-3. You've changed your whole front 3 and maybe your 2 8s. That's almost your front 5 now, and so there's now no players up there who are in the rhythm of the game. So what I've personally noticed is that I think that the flows of the game have started to just become a little bit more disrupted. It's the most time that I think in the Premier League that the ball actually spends the least amount of time on the pitch, and it's just all these little things where I think the flow and the rhythm of the game aren't being benefited by these substitutions. And I had that theory, and obviously I've done a little bit of research, which was on my LinkedIn, which said that a lot of Premier League values had dropped, and that's only halfway through the season. So it'll be interesting to again analyse at the end of the season to see whether that's a consistent pattern or not.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point, because I wouldn't have thought of that. Really, is see, majority of the subs are outfield, and if you're making 5 to 10, you literally 50% of your team is off the bench, and if they're stale or whatever. So, and it only takes, I suppose, it only really takes one guy to be off the mark. You could have 10 players, but if you've got a fullback, then you know that the opposition team is going to be hitting that fullback if he's not up to scratch or whatever. So no, that's really interesting. So I mean, it leads on to almost, we've kind of touched on the psychological aspects and the mentality of the players, but then my kind of analysis background is kind of more thinking in terms of thinking about times to make substitutions, and also not just, and I don't know if you do this or if it's a focus of yours, Sammy, but obviously you say you're working with Wimbledon or whatever team you're contracted to. Are you looking at maybe trends of the opposition in terms of when they are likely to make subs, maybe something they do on the regular? Are you kind of looking at that, or is that something you may start to look at in the future?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So you have to, the beauty of football and the reason we love it is there's so many external factors, and that anything can happen at any given moment. It's such an unpredictable sport. And so it's quite tough to sometimes predict things in games, because you don't really know what's going to happen. But we certainly take those into consideration. And I think it was Bielsa recently who'd done a massive PowerPoint. I think it was on Atletico Bilbao maybe, but he pretty much analysed every time they played the opposition substitutes, so that he could then sort of be aware of what substitutes he might have to bring on. So, for example, they played a team who I think they changed their left back and their left winger every single time for the last 6 games running. So their left channel was always going to have fresh legs or fresh ideas. So his then plan was to make sure that he had a right back or a right wing or a right mid or a right 8 to make sure that they were fresh and legs ready to go and almost duel that. So it's something we definitely consider. And I don't just look at the opposition, but you look at goal scoring trends, you look at home away, you look at as many comprehensive stats as you can to try and get an understanding, because I think, again, the word is deliberate. If you can be deliberate with your substitute to what the game is saying or what the game is playing out like, then that's where you can start to find those sort of successes.
Yeah, definitely. The more you think about it, the for me anyway, is, this is why is it taking so long to be why is it taking so long for someone to kind of do this? And like you said, the amount of things to consider, and people will kind of say, it's becoming, people treat it as a science rather than a game or whatever, but there's so much to it, and obviously the especially you've got your team to focus on, and how you can best attack the opposition, but what are the opposition going to do, and how can you nullify that and be ready to deal with that. So that's really interesting. I mean, in terms of just niche roles, or this obviously being one, I mean, have you any thoughts on any other niche roles that you may think might pop up in the future?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think so. I mean, I've spoke to loads of specialist coaches now, because their advice is always useful to me. With me still being quite young in the industry, the way that they handle themselves is really, really useful. So Thomas Gronemark's a great example, the throwing coach. Yep. He's been fantastic with me and how he sort of runs his program and process and concept and stuff. But I know of a movement coach. I know of a mindset coach. I know of an in possession, out possession coach. I know of a striker coach. I know of a goal kick coach. There's so many different coaches now, and it's not to say that these guys don't know how to coach outside of their speciality. It's to say that they're a first team coach who have just chosen something to specialise in, which makes them unique. So I think that football is going to be more specialist, because I think that's the way that football's going now, is that there's such tight margins, that one goal decides, I think it's like 30% of all Premier League games. So to find that margin, to have that one goal, can now change your season. So I think the way that football's going means that there's going to be these little marginal gains of 1%. And I think the important way for people like me and any person that maybe aspires to me, and Parslow was the one that sort of said this to me, is that it's important that you have like a speciality, because it makes you stand out from the rest, So I'm doing my coaching badges as well, and I have a passion to be a coach. But, no matter where I go in my career now, I'll always have the fact that I can be a first team coach and also do the substitute concept, So that would be my advice. But yeah, I think it's the way that football is going, is that the specialist coaches now is becoming the difference.
Yeah, 100%. So you mentioned Thomas. Thomas has also been on here as well. So
okay, yeah.
Thomas is really interesting. I love that conversation, to be fair. So, but even things like, you've seen a lot more set piece coaches now, and like Andy, like that in the past would have been probably kind of a bit of a chuckle might have been had in terms of, what does this guy even do? Like, it's only free kicks and corners, but there's so much to it in terms of, what there is. And like you said, the niches you mentioned there in terms of mindset coaches, set play, like they are obviously coaches at heart, but they are niching and specializing in that area. And where if a team can get a 1% edge from, properly tactical, doing their substitutions and learning, then obviously that's going to benefit the club in a whole. So I think it's really interesting and curious to see in the future what roles do kind of come about. So just
on that one, I speak to like League Two clubs now who have set piece analysts, and it's just crazy to think like 5 years ago, it was Brentford, me at Lander, and a couple others that had set piece coaches, and they were seen as different, and now you've got League Two clubs. I think I've even seen a National League club who have coaches who specialise in set pieces, and I think while that's brilliant, the more for every set piece coach that gets appointed, it becomes almost, I think, less unique, because now then it's becoming the norm. Do you know what I mean? It was like goalkeeping coaches. Everyone has a goalkeeping coach now, because they have to level up with the playing ground. So that's where I think those extra special roles in throwing coaches is now becoming even more unique, because that's now the difference, because everyone's sort of on par with certain other aspects of the game.
Yeah, definitely. And just like, I think maybe, I mean, not just Brian, but I know some clubs are now, in terms of the scouting and recruitment, they're having scouts that specialise in certain positions rather than just
I've seen that.
a forward scout or a fullback scout. So And it makes sense, like when you think about it. So it's just kind of how the game evolves and how things become more efficient and how teams can get an advantage really on others.
Mm.
So that is really interesting. So in terms of then, let's say you're working as a consultant then, Sammy. So you would obviously approach a club and effectively you're then pitching why they should use your services. So that kind of was interesting to me because again, it links back to the networking, but just the case of kind of putting yourself out there and being confident in what you can bring to a club. So I'm just curious to know how you, I mean, what kind of things are you kind of, obviously not the specific things, but what are you kind of presenting in terms of, are you kind of showing the impacts? Are you maybe, before you, say if you were presenting to a club, are you looking back at their substitution, maybe look at some of their games and stats? Like how does that work?
Yeah, so teams reach out to me, and or I'll reach out to them if I think that, because I track at the moment, I track every single English team's substitute value. So it really allows me to analyze and go, wow, they're struggling, or wow, this is something I think I can go and add value to. Yeah. So if it's that particular instance, then I might reach out to them and say, listen, I've been tracking it. This is what I want to add value. Or they reach out to me. And yeah, then it's a case of me having a presentation. I've sort of got a presentation ready to go, which outlines a little bit of the results that I've had at Wimbledon and other clubs that I've done for the consultancy, and then touches a little bit on their data and what I've collected from them, and it almost details how I think I can add value, where I think I can take their subs, and what impact that will have, in the grand scheme of things of league, financial, and the longer term effects of the club. So that's sort of the process. But you've got to be careful because you don't want to do too much and then you leave yourself open a little bit. So it's a lesson that I've learned. It's something I'm getting better at each time.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of then what, we mentioned you're obviously still very young, Sammy, and what's your goals for the future then in terms of whether you mentioned you want to be, I think I've said you want to be a gaffer at one point.
Yeah.
That's cool. So just kind of talk us around that really, if you can, in terms of what you're aspiring to kind of be.
Yeah, so I'd love to be a gaffer. I think I've got a particular way of how I think football should be. I think I've experienced a few negatives in football, and I disagree with sometimes the way that things are done in football a little bit, in terms of sometimes I think there can be a bit of a wrong culture, and I'm very much someone who would want to put that right. So I would love to be a gaffer and have my own changing room, my own culture, my own dressing room, my own values. But that being said, I also have sort of my own style of play that I really love watching, and I'd love to be able to be in charge of a team and have my own identity sort of implemented into that team. So it's something that, again, I mean, the average manager is 43, 44, you know what I mean? So I've got 20 years yet, really, which is crazy when you think about it. But it's definitely in my aspirations at some point to have a go at it and see. It's not for everyone. I believe I hold the qualities, but we'll see. But yeah, it's definitely in my goals.
Yeah, nice. Well, good looking that. I mean, in terms of you have touched upon a little bit of advice kind of for coaches earlier on in terms of like niching down and stuff. But would you, I mean, is there any kind of other things you would say for advice? And this is kind of not just, obviously someone might be out there that's wanting to do something similar to you, whether it be substitutions or just another niche consultancy role. But what kind of advice would you give to someone like that, but also just a coach in general?
Yeah, so I would say there are two that probably jump to mind instantly. The first one is right back when I started at Bournemouth Academy, so I was like 17, 18. Carl Robson, who was the guy that brought me there, is head of recruitment at the academies now, scout there. He said you have to be rejected 1,000 times in order to be successful. And so that even today, I've got something on my wardrobe, which is the amount of times I've been rejected for a job, for a club, for anything, in life. If I get rejected, I strike it out. And it's almost helped me become absolutely fine with rejection. Do you know what I mean? It's not something that I fear anymore. Yeah. And, I could get rejected on the spot and it's don't worry, we'll go again. Do you know what I mean? So that's the biggest advice, because the more you put yourself out there, the more you're going to get success, but you're going to have your fair share of rejection first before it starts snowballing into success. And I've definitely had that. Yeah. And the other thing is to I always tell myself to just try and be the hardest working man in the room. Like, no matter what room you're in, try and outwork everyone, because, I think it was Michael Jordan that said champions are made when no one are watching. And that again, that rings true to me, because while some people go out and drink on a Saturday night or go and, chill or pop Netflix on, I sit down and try and get into a book or try and, research a league that I've not researched before, or try and educate myself so that, you have that advantage over other people that are trying to have that job, because football is such a tough industry to break into. I mean, I'm sure you've had it yourself, but it's, to get a full-time job in football is an incredible accomplishment. So, you've really got to earn that position.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I think some people don't actually realize the extent, because, when people are coming out of university and things, like university are churning out thousands every year, and there's only so many jobs to go, and everyone wants to work in football, and once the people that are in there, obviously they probably don't want to leave, so their jobs aren't really up for grabs. So it's about either creating a job like you've done, almost creating something, or just continually knocking on the door, and you will get a lot of no's before you get a yes. So that's good advice. One thing we've not kind of spoke about, Sammy, is just, and it leads on to a bit of a quick fire round in terms of, we've seen it in the past where some clubs will make, and it's probably more kind of stand out in terms of when it's a goalkeeper. So like, when you've seen it at the World Cup potentially, or the Euros, where a club will literally take the goalkeeper off and bring someone new on just for the penalty shootout. And I think, and again, curious to see what you think about this, but from my thought process, it's not an outfield position. It's probably less of a physical, it's not as though they have to kind of get up to speed. It's more a case of just saving a penalty. But what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it. I think I'm a big fan of it if it's done right. I think that's probably the best way to phrase it. So if you're going to do it for the sake of doing it, and again, I've said it before, but if you just do it for doing it for hope's sake, then I don't necessarily agree with it. But if you do it with an actual plan, where you've sat down with this keeper, you've told him every single penalty and where they've gone in their last 8, so that this guy's got more of an advantage over the goalkeeper that's out there. Yeah. He's out of the pressure at the moment, so he's coming in fresh mentally. He's gone into the changing rooms or the functional fitness room or whatever, and done a few dives or done a few explosive movements, so that his first explosive movement isn't a live penalty in a live game. Yeah. Then I think there's absolutely value to be had there, because you're preparing this player for this exact instance. But I don't know. I've actually never been involved in a club where that's happened, so I don't know the protocol that they sort of have when they make those substitutions. But if they're doing it with a plan rather than a hope, then I personally think there's value to be had there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not to say that the goalkeeper coming off is not as good. It's just knowing the role in the team. Obviously, the goalkeeper that started the game was obviously picked to start for a reason. So that and if the other one that's coming on is better historically in saving, maybe he's got a bigger reach or whatever in terms of the penalty. It makes sense. You have in other sports, you have kickers, things that people that specialize in certain aspects of the game.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So it makes sense when you think about it. So in terms of, you mentioned earlier in terms of like kind of reading and kind of continually learning, Sammy, do you have any books, and it doesn't have to be sport related really, anything that you've maybe read recently, books, podcasts, or anything that you think would add value to anyone listening?
Yeah, the book question's tough, because I love books. I try and go, I always set myself targets each year to try and get through a certain amount, and it's tough to try and pinpoint like books ahead of other books, because I think every book I read is like, well, that's the best book I've ever read. Do you know what I mean? And then I read the next one, that's the best one I've ever read. So probably the 3 that stand out to me the most would be Clive Woodward's How to Win. I thought that was really good. That talks more about culture, and particularly culture in rugby. And I think there's a lot that I can resonate with in that respect. There's a book called Numbers Game, which is what I'm going through at the moment. And again, that's really about sort of data, all of the fractions behind goals and the incredible data that some of these guys go into, which is great to read, because it inspires me thinking about substitutions. Yeah. And the other one, again, not football related, but basketball, and it's Phil Jackson's 11 Rings. So he was the Bulls coach and the LA Lakers coach, and I've only just started reading it, but I've watched The Last Dance on Netflix and I thought it was the best series I've ever watched. So that's another recommendation. But and again, his culture and the way that he handles players is just, Sir Alex Ferguson level. It's like his standards are ridiculous. So those 3 books. But I could sit here and give, I've just bought a Bielsa one called Rotations, and buzzing to get through that. That's a little bit more on the playing style, but and on podcasts, apart from the one that we're on now, the high performance podcast will be the other one.
Yeah.
I think they again have a great variety of sort of audience and listener and guest, and it's not just one thing related. It's a real mixture. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, there are so many great tools out there now. There are so many great tools out there.
Yeah, perfect. I'll link those below for anyone interested. The first two I have, but the Phil Jackson one is something is one that I've been meaning to get, but I've never read it before, so maybe I need to check that one out definitely. So, okay, so before we kind of wrap up, Sammy, of course, your time. So I just want to give you a few quick fire questions. So just who do you support, Sammy? Who's your team?
So this is controversial. So I don't actually really support a team.
Okay.
Because the whole concept to me, this probably make me sound really like an alien now, but I find it easier to support managers because they're consistent with what they do. So you're supporting the same thing over and over again. So for example, Bielsa is one of my favorite managers. You know, he always presses, he always rotates, he's always hardworking, he's always very honest and humble. And they're things that I resonate with every time. So no matter what club he goes to, I tend to find myself swaying a little bit towards that club. Whereas I look at some fans, let's go Manchester United, for example, you know, they're fans who are supporters of the club, slate 3 managers before they like one. And that to me is just crazy. Do you know what I mean? Like your job is to support. Yeah. So I find it easier to resonate with managers because they have consistent value. So it's a boring answer, but yeah, I find several managers easier to resonate with.
Oh no, that's interesting. So okay, so imagine we are watching a Bielsa team, right? So Bielsa team is currently your favourite team at the moment. So it's the last minute. Your team's got a penalty. You need to bring on a substitution to take it. Who are you bringing on to take that penalty?
Oh, that's a great question.
Past or present?
I would go Ivan Toney at the moment.
Okay. Yeah,
I like his technique. I like his style. I like his confidence. Yeah, I'm a big fan of him, and I just trust him. You know what I mean? When you look at him, you trust him to do what's right, and I trust him to put it away for us.
Perfect. Same question, but for a free kick just on the edge of the box, I mean.
James Ward-Prowse. I love the fella. I've been a fan of James Ward-Prowse since I was like 16, and he was sort of just breaking into the team, and he's had like a few years where he started getting good, but obviously like last 2. He's been like, you know, he's you know, got an England call up, hasn't he? So it's great. I'm buzzing. I don't know if you can see, but I've actually got a picture of him on my wall as well, just because I'm such a fan. I used to play Football Manager, and every time I played, he would be my first signing. James Ward-Prowse in the door, because I think he's a great player.
Amazing. And then you need to bring on a fresh goalkeeper for an upcoming shootout. Who are you bringing on?
The one that springs to mind, I wouldn't say I'm overly educated on goalkeepers. So the one that springs to mind is Tim Krul.
Yeah, well, that happened, didn't it? That was one of the one brought on for the shootout.
I know that the Morecambe goalkeeper this season is on a hell of a run of saving pens. He saved something like 5 out of 6 pens in open play or something like that. Yeah, he's on an incredible run. So he might be a shout as well. But I'd look at data and pick who you think is best.
Yeah, perfect. So no, appreciate that, Sammy. So just then, where can people find you, mate? You mentioned obviously LinkedIn? Where can people connect with you on there, and kind of where can they see you moving forward?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is probably my biggest one. I try to avoid social media. I'm not massively on it, but I have just got Twitter, but it's foreign to me at the moment. I'm struggling to understand how it all works. So LinkedIn is probably the best one. That's where I publish most of my work and have some great chats around football. So that's probably the best the best place for me.
Perfect. Well, like I said, for those listening, so I'll link the books below that you mentioned, Sammy. Obviously, people feel free to check Sammy out on LinkedIn. Sammy, it's been a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks again for your time, and I'm sure we'll catch up soon.
No, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate the opportunity and the platform, and it's been great chatting some football.
Perfect. Have a good day, Sammy. Thank you very much, mate.
Cheers, Chris. You too.